Man, we're on an excellent journey, pun intended, I suppose, here in Bellevue, and we're just trying to follow the Lord's Spirit and what He has for our community and what He has for our church and our town, and been going at this. Been here in Bellevue, publicly, I guess, open for about 3 months now. Started in mid-October, and so it's been a good ride, and just thank you guys being a part of this, and very good. So February, Valentine's Day, right? It's Love Month here in the United States, and so this week I did just a brief Wikipedia search on who in the world is Saint Valentine. Does anybody actually know the history? I'm just curious. I didn't know it before. A little bit. Okay, yeah. So Saint Valentine was an actual person who, according to legend, there was more than one Saint Valentine, but according to legend, the Saint Valentine that actually ended up transforming or morphing or leading into Valentine's Day, this Saint Valentine was actually martyred. He was killed for his faith. And so it was the mid-200s, so about 250 years after Christ. He found himself in jail for doing two things. He found himself in jail for refusing to worship the emperor, the Roman emperor at this time, and also for marrying Roman soldiers. Now, we say marrying Roman soldiers. What's the issue with that? Well, in that culture, that was a big issue, because if soldiers were married, then they didn't have to go to war. And the emperor and the Roman powers didn't like that too much. And so St. Valentine finds himself in jail, and he's in custody. And the jailer, the head of the jail, the warden, has a daughter who's been blind, according to legend, or according to what I read, from birth. St. Valentine is sharing the gospel of Christ, the good news, with this jailer. And as a work of power, he heals this jailer's daughter as she receives her sight. And according to, again, what I've read on Wikipedia, it's not an intensive search, but according to, I guess, legend, she receives her sight, the jailer receives Christ, and allows St. Valentine to go free. And he continues to preach Christ, and sooner or later, he finds himself back in jail this time, except it's under the Roman emperor. And he tries sharing the gospel, the good news, with Claudius II, I believe, and it doesn't end so well. And on February 14th, he was beaten with clubs, and he was beheaded. Yeah, right? So here you have somebody's life who, instance number one, God does a miracle. He delivers him from jail. He finds himself right back in jail. And second time, his life here on earth was ended by earthly powers, right? It's quite the paradox looking at his life. About 200 years after this happened, so this happened mid-200s, so about mid-400s is when the Roman Church actually started celebrating this martyr, St. Valentine. And it was called St. Valentine's Day. And they were celebrating his death. They were celebrating the fact that he stood strong in his faith, and that he didn't give up, and that he continued to preach Christ in the face of persecution. And they're celebrating the fact that he died, right? And in our culture, again, some of that's a little strange to us. But it's not as strange as we might think. So we generally don't celebrate in our popular culture martyrs for a faith. Generally in our culture, when we think of people who die for their faith, we think of extremists. We think of things that would turn us away from celebrating that. But as a culture, we do celebrate those who have fallen in battle to defend America, to defend the Constitution, to give us the freedoms that we enjoy here. And so we do celebrate people who fall, who stand for something and give up their earthly life for it. It is a part of our culture. So it's an interesting paradox. And so what happened? How did St. Valentine's Day in the 450s become Valentine's Day as we celebrate it in our culture here in the United States, and really even in a lot of Western culture throughout the world? Well, again, according to legend, the night before St. Valentine was beheaded, he sent a letter to the girl whom he had healed, the girl who had received her sight that was blind. And at the end of the letter, the night before he was beheaded, he had signed it, "Your Valentine." And so this started a tradition of sending letters, or Valentine's letters. And throughout the years, again, 450, and so we've got 1,500 years of development, of history that we can't go through all of this, but it's really interesting to see how the start of St. Valentine has morphed into this idea of sending love letters and chocolates and celebrating love as our culture does here today. And so the question that I have for us and that we're going to look at over the next 3 weeks is what is love? And so we're going to look at this idea of making love last for the next 3 weeks. And I'm a little bit of a Bible nerd, and so I'm doing my best to make Bible information fun and exciting. But some of it is just like heady, right? But ultimately the Spirit of God transforms our hearts, right? And ultimately that's where life change comes from. So that's what we're all relying on. But I promise if you just stick with me this morning that I think when we end this morning you're going to have some handles on some different ideas that maybe you haven't necessarily considered in depth before. And so what is love? We see in Valentine's Day that we tend to just buy love for others, right? We tend to equate love with a sense of money. And there's a part to that, right, where we can show value for people based on money. However, I think there's a subtle idea that when we buy roses or we buy chocolates or things like that, and we're showing that we love somebody, there's this idea that even if we did something wrong, who's ever been in this boat with me, right? You do something wrong the day or two before and you go buy roses or chocolates and you say, I'm sorry, right? Anybody? No? Okay, just me apparently. Yep.
I haven't gotten chocolates in a long time.
Oh. I've been good for a long time. Thank you for that compliment. Yeah. There's a sense that we can buy love. Well, there's a book in the Bible. It's called Song of Solomon or Song of Songs, and we're going to look at that book. So if you have your Bibles with you, you can make your way there. But this first verse that I'm going to read will be on the screen, and most of the verses we reread this morning will be on the screen. It says this: if a man tried to buy love with all of his wealth, his offer would be utterly scorned. It's this idea that love cannot be bought. But I think sometimes we assume that it can. And sometimes we assume that it can be fixed with money, that it can be fixed with just one act of money or purchase of something and an apology. So that, again, brings us to the question, what is love? And love is something that is extremely hard to define. Extremely hard to define. Why? Part of the reason is because of the way that we use it, especially the word love in our English language. And so I love pizza. Anybody with me? Love pizza. Man, I love pizza. Oh, I love pizza. I do. I love Carly. Anybody with me? Love Carly. You're not sure how you're supposed to respond to this one because you don't exactly know what I mean by the word love. And so we're not certain of what I mean by that. So if I were to give some more explanation, say, who in here loves Carly as a friend? If you've gotten to know her and you love her as a friend, yeah, so there's some of us that have gotten to know Carly, we would love her as friends. But the hesitation came because I'm the only one that gets to love Carly, right? So I'm the only one that gets to love my wife. But I also love my children. And I'm the only one who gets to fulfill a certain role that provides a certain love for my children, but yet that's different than the love for my wife. And I love to play drums. Thanks. Love to play drums. So love, right? What is love? See, our culture has defined some what I think are faulty perceptions of love. And so if you have this handout that was on the seat this morning, we're going to start looking at this handout, and this is going to be a roadmap for our morning. Handout looks like this. Everybody have one? Anybody need one? Okay, good. So faulty perceptions of love, some ways that I think our culture has missed what love is. Number one, right up at the top, love is heartbreak. I think some people in our culture, when they hear the word love, some people equate that with heartbreak. When some people hear the word love in our culture, they get nervous. And why is that? Because people in our culture, maybe even some of us, have been hurt in the name of love. We've been hurt under the guise of love. There was somebody who said that they loved us, that expressed their love, and yet they would go and do terrible things. They would desert us, or they would treat us in ways that were unbecoming of love. And so some of us get nervous. Some of us, and rightfully so, can see love sometimes as heartbreak. In our culture, number two, faulty idea, love is sex. I think some people in our culture have a faulty idea that love equals sex. And that sex is tainted, right? That view is faulty, it's tainted. We don't have to look far. Most of us, I would have a hunch, are aware of what is happening in our culture with the invention of the internet and the exploitation of the internet, and how sex has become incredibly perverse and tainted. And it's always been abused, yes. Uh-oh. Uh-oh. I think we popped the breaker.
They can hear you. You sound
Okay.
They can hear you.
Well, until that HVAC system turns on, here we go. But what is it about sex for our culture? Man, sex sells. We also understand that too. We see it on TV. We see it on advertisements. What is it? Well, there's something about sex that drives to the center of the human heart and human existence. And it can be used as a power for good. It can be celebrated in goodness, and it can be used as a twisted power for evil and destruction. We're familiar with that. We're going to get to more of that later. So then, number three, love is elusive. Love is elusive. And so some people... Oh!
We're popping.
Hey, we're just going to roll with it. We're just going to roll with it.
Keep going.
Some people in our culture have a faulty idea that love is all elusive. Chances are, most of us know somebody who is single and maybe they're not okay with it. Maybe you would find yourself in that place. Maybe you know somebody in that place, single and not okay with it. And that's a hard place to be, I'm sure. I mean, I remember back in high school, before Carly and I started dating and got married. I remember back in high school, and I was kind of an awkward teenager, and I just remember always wanting to have a girlfriend, and I remember that desire, and I can't imagine what that feels like, amplified by year after year, amplified by experience after experience. It doesn't go the way that we think love should. And so I'm sure that this is a hard place to be, and I'm not trying to downplay any of this at all. But I think we tend to reinforce the idea sometimes, those of us who are married, without even meaning to. But here's how pervasive I think this idea is in our culture. Movies celebrate people who find love all the time. We even use terms, usually, sometimes, when we describe our marriage, when we describe how thankful we are, and we use terms like, man, I'm lucky that I have my spouse. And terminology reveals some things that are deep inside that we see or that we hold, and we may not even be aware of. And so every time that we say we're lucky, we consider ourselves lucky because we found love. And all of this is reinforcing this idea that love is elusive. And I think that's a faulty idea in our culture. And so Before we get into the Song of Solomon or the Song of Psalms a little bit more in depth, a little bit of background about this book and about this idea of love in the scriptures. So there are quite a few different words in the Hebrew and Greek languages that are translated in love. In the Song of Songs, in fact, there's actually three separate base words that are translated for the word love in this Song of Songs alone. And so this Song of Songs or Song of Solomon is it's a love poem. It is like a celebration of this picture of love and what love should be and what love is and what love looks like between a man and a woman. This was written about 3,000 years ago. And this love poem in the Jewish culture was considered so explicit, so erotic, that young Jewish boys weren't allowed to read it until they were older. So I think that's an interesting frame of reference for what we're going to consider. And so this love poem, we're going to begin our study here in the Song of Songs, Song of Solomon. And as we do that, I want to give us an overview of the book, and you're going to see this on your handout. This outline is provided by Jack Deere in the Bible Knowledge Commentary. So what is the structure of this book? Man, this book is a confusing book to read, and there's been a lot of different interpretations on what it means and how it's structured and what it looks like. So this is one outline that I hope is helpful for you. But it goes like this. We can see in this poem or collection of songs a courtship, a wedding, a maturation of the marriage where their marriage grows and is strengthened, a conclusion on the nature and the power of love, and a picture of love, an explanation of love within that. And then there's an epilogue on how love began. And so this is the outline of this book. And so what I'd love to just challenge you to do is this week, maybe 3 separate times, if you sit down with this outline and read through the Song of Songs. It's about 8 or 9 chapters long, and it'll probably take about 15 or 20 minutes per read. But as you're reading through this, pay attention to this outline and see if you can begin to comprehend a little bit more of what is happening in this book. And as you read this book, you're going to see love that's used in various senses. So sometimes it refers to a person with a particular relationship with someone else. We talked about this a little bit earlier. Carly is my love. Sometimes it refers to a strong emotional affection or a high regard for someone. I love Carly with all of my heart. And sometimes it refers to sexual desire or passion towards someone or with someone. Carly, let's make love tonight. Awkward. Ooh, awkward. Awkward. We struck a chord. Why is this topic a taboo? Why can we not talk about it? Here's a whole book in the Bible that we're going to look at that shows us a picture of love, and there's 3 senses of love that we're going to see within this book. And we're always okay with the first 2. But then something happens when we get to the 3rd one, and it becomes very difficult for us to talk about. So let's begin looking at these 3 senses, and let's see what we can learn from the Song of Songs. So number 1, we're going to see love as special companion or soulmate. Love as special companion or soulmate. So Song of Songs, chapter 2, verses 2 through 3. Like a lily among thistles is my darling among young women, and like the finest apple tree in the orchard is my lover among other young men. So there's a Hebrew word here, raya, that often reflects this sense of the word love, the sense of special companionship or a soulmate. This person is a best friend. The sense of love is someone who you can tell or share anything with. It's the idea that there's such a close friendship or such a close connection that we can be completely
free and open in the sense of who we are, where we do not have any guard any further, but they can see us for who we are, and they can see us for who we are, and we see them for who they are. Yes. But it's a friendship, a companionship, and this should be the core of any healthy relationship, right? And sometimes in our culture, this base, this companionship, this friendship is easy to push aside. We get busy. We have kids, and kids desire attention, and kids desire relationship and friendship and companionship, and there's a love for our kids as well in the sense. And sometimes what happens is that we will tend to avoid or neglect that companionship with our spouse or with the one that we love most. And so this friendship or this companionship is one sense of the word love. Second sense is love as deep affection or commitment. Love as deep affection or commitment. So there's 3 scriptures on your handout. They're also going to be on the screen. My lover is mine, and I am his. I am my lover's, and my lover is mine. I am my lover's, and he claims me as my own. This is a deep affection. It's a desire. It's a heartache to be with someone. It's more than a feeling, though. It's a willingness to commit to being with someone. See, this is a love of willpower. It's more than a temporary urge. It's an emotion that leads to commitment. It's something that will make things last. This is the type of love that's, I'm not going to go anywhere. It's the type of love where you say, I know that you're going to mess up, and I know that things might get hard or rough, but we are going to be committed to each other. This isn't where you look at a relationship and you say, once things begin to get dull or boring, that I'm going to leave and I find something else. It's a love of commitment, and that commitment says, I will be here. And there's a hurdle in here, and that's this. It's accepting that you are no longer your own in this type of love, in this type of connection. This deep affection, this commitment goes 2 ways. You now belong to someone, and someone belongs to you. It's a love of commitment. And so the word that often references this commitment or deep affection is this word, Hebrew word, ahava. This same word also often refers to physical attraction. And number 3, the third sense that we see is love as sexual attraction or desire. Love as sexual attraction or desire. 3 verses on your handout. 3 verses will be on the screen. I'm going to read those 3 verses now. Promise me, O women of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and wild deer, not to awaken love until the time is right. Promise me, O women of Jerusalem, by the gazelles and the wild deer, not to awaken love until the time is right. Promise me, O women of Jerusalem, not to awaken love until the time is right. 3 times throughout this poem or collection of songs, the writer encourages not to awaken love, not to awaken ahaba until it's time. See, my hunch is generally when we read this, we think that this means do not awaken sexual love and passions until it's time. I think that this starts with affection. Here's what I mean. It begins with a strong, positive emotion of high regard for someone. And when we develop that emotion, when we allow that affection to take place in our hearts, then the sexual desire begins to awaken inside. And so this affection, I think, is the starting point. And when we develop this affection, we know this stage most likely as puppy love. It's that stage of a relationship where no one can do any wrong. Right? Because there's such an affection, there's such a regard that we're willing to look past shortcomings on behalf of the other person. And I think that this is what the writer is referring to primarily when they say, don't awaken love until the time is right. Every time this verse is referenced, it's referenced by the lady in the poem talking to the women of Jerusalem. And what else do we know is generally to be true in our culture? What else has science told us about our human nature? Generally, the men are the people that look for the physical attraction, and generally women start with the affection. And so I think when we allow ourselves to have an affection for someone before the time is right, male or female, that is what leads us down a path of danger. And so here's something, this isn't culturally romantic, but I think it's scripturally appropriate. And it's this. You don't fall in love. You and I don't fall in love. You and I, we choose to love. Love is a choice. And that makes it sound cold or dim. But when it comes down to it, love in its fullest sense is a choice. See, when you choose to love someone, it's not just for you, it's not just for me. When you and I choose to love somebody, it's also for them. See, we make a commitment to go through the hard times with someone else. When we choose to love and when there's moments of weakness in the other person, because we've chosen to love, we don't leave, we don't abandon, we stay and we work. See, abandoning is a choice, and loving is also a choice. We choose to love. And when we choose to love, nothing shapes us more into the image of Christ as when we choose to love. Nothing shapes us more into the image of Christ when we choose to love. When we choose to love. So in addition to this Hebrew word, ahava, that has two meanings of both commitment and sexual desire, there's another Hebrew word that is dod, that refers to two lovers literally boiling in the wildest sense. And this is probably the moments where the young men weren't allowed to read the poem. Make sense? Okay. Song of Songs 1, 2, second verse. Kiss me again and again, for your love is sweeter than wine. You know, just makes you squirm a little bit. A little uncomfortable. Should I really be reading this out loud? Right? This is how the song opens. A little bit of background on this word is this is where the Greek word eros was derived from, and eros is where we derived our term erotic. See the connection with what's being discussed here in the scriptures. The unfortunate thing is that when we hear erotic, probably most of us think dirty, or we think sinful. Okay? But here's the Song of Solomon, or the Song of Songs in the Bible, celebrating this type of love between a man and a woman. So for those of us that have made a decision in our hearts, where we've placed full authority of these collection of books and scriptures, that these are God's revealed will and word to humankind. For those of us that have made this decision, and we've made this Bible our authority for life. If it were in here, then why would it be dirty? So sometimes when we're reading the Bible and we're reading in context, we read of things that are in the Bible that God does not approve of. Absolutely. When we read through the Song of Songs, I don't see that to be the case. I don't see a disapproval of what's happening. Rather, I see it as a celebration of what is happening. And so, in talking through this message with Pastor Ken, he had just one thing that he really encouraged, and this is just for parents of children, young to middle to high school. There's a collection of books that we have a few handouts on the table. But here's what happens when, as parents, that we treat this topic as taboo. Here's what happens. I was a youth pastor for a while. I'm going to tell you exactly what happens. We don't talk about it, and our children's friends at school will talk about it. And our children's friends at school, who may not be followers of Christ, will talk about it. And they've probably talked about it with their parents. And I didn't grow up in a household that followed Christ. Okay? And here's how my talk went. Don't be like Sodom, use a condom. Some of you get the humor in that. It was strange. But that was the only talk that I received, and it lasted about 15 seconds. And it wasn't awkward because it was beginning and end. But what do you think I thought after that talk? What do you think my friends and I talked about after that talk? So the peers of our children, that's what they're hearing. And here's what they're probably saying. They're probably not saying, hey, my parents told me about this. They're probably saying, hey, take a look at this. Slide over the phone. When we treat this topic as taboo, we leave the topic open for our culture to teach what this topic is and what it should be. Granted, it's uncomfortable, there's a tension, but when we begin to look at the entirety of our lives and we begin to look at the entirety of the picture of what God has designed love to look like, and we look at all three senses of the word love, and we don't leave one of them aside, but yet we engage in discussion, and we engage in teaching others, and we engage in a biblical worldview of a New Testament picture of love as Jesus expounds on it further, but also what Jesus understood from the Old Testament for love to be. See, when we do that, that's when we can begin to change culture. That's when we can begin to train our young ones to stand strong in the culture, to not succumb or bow down to culture. As a piece of data, the average age of a child's first exposure to an adult film is in elementary school. If we don't talk about it, they will. They will. And they'll hear about it. And if we don't engage with the topic, culture will teach them. So when we see sex is dirty and when we avoid this topic, we tend to neglect the fulfillment or celebration of sexual appetite in our marriage relationships. Begin to neglect what it should mean. We begin to overlook, and this is instruction that Paul was an apostle in the New Testament. By the way, he was celibate. He was not married. This is the instructions that Paul gives to individuals who were married in the Old Testament. This will be on the screen. 1 Corinthians 7:5. He says, do not deprive each other of sexual relations. Speaking to husband and wife. unless you both agree to refrain from sexual intimacy for a limited time, so you can give yourselves more completely to prayer. Afterward, you should come together again, so that Satan won't be able to tempt you because of your lack of self-control. What is Paul saying? We can get stuck on the lack of self-control pretty quickly. I think there's a little bit of a bigger issue of what's happening. Paul is saying that we invite the devil into our marriage when we neglect the sexual intimacy part. More than that, I would take it maybe a step further. This may be a stretch, but I think the principle still applies. When we avoid the topic in discussion and we treat it as taboo, we open the door for the devil to run wild on something that we're afraid to engage with and we're afraid to talk about because it may make us feel uncomfortable. So what's the point? The point is on that aspect that we need to begin engaging on this topic a little bit more. See, we're created to experience all three senses of love together. A soulmate with no commitment, with no affection, with no sexual desire, no passion. A companion is a friend. One sense, a love. A commitment or really deep affection with no friendship or companionship, with no sexual desire or no passions. That's just cold. When there's nothing else except only a commitment. It's dry. A sexual appetite with no commitment, no companionship is wrecking our society. We don't need to go through that anymore. But what about even a sexual appetite and companionship? When there's no commitment, our culture calls this, there's a term for it, friends with benefits. Is how our culture defines it. And by the way, our culture says that's okay. See, when we miss out on one of the three senses of love, we're falling short of God's ideal. And when we begin to look at ourselves, when we begin to look at our lives, when we begin to look at our hearts, my hunch is most of us fall short in one of three areas of love. We fall short of God's ideal. See, there's a temptation for some of us to say, we're married, that sexual thing, not an issue. But beneath that, is there still companionship and friendship? Is there still a commitment, a deep affection? And when one of those two begin to deteriorate or begin to fall short, we're missing God's standard. We're missing God's ideal. Does it seem right when we neglect our spouse for our friends? Put another way, does it seem right when we develop deep affection for another person outside of our spouse? There's a term for that, emotional affair. We don't think that it's okay, but we tend to not examine ourselves on the friendship and on the commitment of love. We tend to only examine ourselves on the only thing we're not willing to talk about, the sexual aspect of love. So I don't think we really need convinced of this. I think most of us in here have probably seen an example of two individuals, man and woman, who were married. And at some point in their marriage, the friendship began to fizzle out. Or at some point in their marriage, someone was unwilling to choose to love, and the affection dwindled away, and the commitment walked away. And those two individuals were followers of Jesus. They were followers of the Lord. They were trying to do the right thing, but they listened to the wrong voice. The Holy Spirit was drowned out by the words of our culture. And what happened? We all are probably familiar with this story in one way or another. They ended up splitting apart. Not God's ideal. Worse than that is what also probably ended up happening is one, if not both, of those individuals ended up walking away from the church and turning their back on their Savior because they listened to the wrong voice. Because we wouldn't have honest conversations before there was the big issue. See, when we separate these loves, destruction happens. We'll never be satisfied when we don't have all three of these loves operating in our lives, with one caveat. One caveat is Paul, the Apostle Paul, talks often about how he wished everyone were single so that they could devote their lives to serving the Lord. But for those who did not have that special grace, as he would call it, that they would marry, and that was okay too. Sometimes the one love that should be missing is sexual. And often in our culture, it's the one love elevated above all three. Do you see the picture of where we are in our society? And what are we to do? My first hunch is read the Song of Songs. I would suggest, again, using this outline, reading through it a couple times this week, praying, God, show me where I don't see this as you see this. God, through your Holy Spirit, reveal to me where I don't understand or where my thoughts are twisted. And then God, through your Holy Spirit, give me the strength and the wisdom and the courage to engage in conversation, to not shy away from any part, but more than all of that, to be changed into more and more of Jesus. And that's such a picture of God's love for us. That there's a friendship, there's a companionship, and that there's a deep affection and a commitment. As God looks at us, let's take a moment